Yeah, so I'm Kristofer Rios, and I am one of the directors and co-executive producers of Menudo Forever Young. And I'm also a journalist of well over a decade now.
Let's have a real big welcome for
Menudo.
Manager Edgardo Diaz adopted a fountain of youth strategy. The individual members are simply replaced once they reach the age of 16.
Sigue rotando, ¿me enteran? Y así pues pueden mantener Menudo para siempre.
They were the first boy band because the formula wasn't already there. They had these massive pop hits that were internationally popular. That is something that Menudo taught us boy bands could do.
It's called menuditis.
Nosotros teníamos una avenida paralizada en Nueva York.
The Puerto Rican community was invisible to English language media.
Y de pronto llegan 5 chicos puertorriqueños rompiendo con todo ese estereotipo, cantando español.
And you're like, oh my God, these kids are like me. Such a sense of pride. And that was just so freaking magical.
There were a lot of good things that came out of Menudo, but there was a price to pay for that magic. None of us were really prepared for what it was really going to be like. There was no interest in protecting us. We felt vulnerable.
I remember being in Brazil and finding myself in a room of these older men asking me if I'm already liking sex.
What was Customs doing with you? How many drugs?
We never do that thing.
I started throwing up blood. I could have died. If it was gonna cost me my life, I'd rather not be famous and live.
Menudo was a beautiful thing that came out of a not so beautiful situation.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that's what it was.
Menudo opened up the possibility that this is something we can aspire to.
La historia de Menudo will live on forever.
This is Factual America. We're brought to you by Alamo Pictures, an Austin and London-based production company making documentaries about America for international audiences. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. This week it is my pleasure to welcome award-winning filmmaker Kristofer Rios, director and producer of the HBO Max docuseries Menudo, Forever Young. The film brings to life the uplifting as well as tragic story of Menudo, arguably the first international boy band and one of the most successful. Starting from humble roots in 1970s Puerto Rico, the group conquered the pop world in the 1980s and 90s, taking their brand of Latin pop worldwide. But as the boys grew older and their voices started changing, they discovered that they were easily replaceable, with a steady stream of 12 to 15-year-olds in the wings ready to chase their dreams of stardom. Such success came with an unnecessary price, however, as revealed by former members. The boys, separated from their parents, were often overworked, neglected, emotionally and physically abused, and became easy targets for sexual predators. Stay tuned as we talk with Kristofer about Menudo, the allegations made in the film, and how the band still has a fond place in the hearts of millions. Kristofer, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Going okay, all things considered.
Yeah, you need to share because you've already told us. You've got COVID.
I've got COVID. I've managed to. I think I actually got COVID early on. At this time, I was working for ABC News, and I was out quite a bit. But since then, I've managed to avoid it. And then just the other day, I came down with a fever. The fever's done, but it's COVID's a journey. So I'm still feeling a little fatigued. Yeah.
well, as I said before, I think you're the first guest we've had who's actually had COVID when we've been talking with them. So thank you so much for soldiering on. It's very much appreciated. Yeah. As our listeners and viewers should know, as they've heard the intro, we're talking with Kristofer Rios. His film is Menudo, Forever Young, released in June on HBO Max. Does it have a wider release coming? Is it going international at any time soon?
Well, I believe that because it's on HBO Max, it's on all of its international platforms. I mean, I know for a fact that we we were out in Latin America, and in, you know, and in Spain. I would be surprised if we aren't, you know, kind of not shared more widely, but we've been doing really well in the Latin American market right now.
I can imagine you have been.
Yeah.
I mean, how's the reaction been so far? And congratulations for getting the film to this stage.
Thank you. You know, I think for me personally, and I probably do speak for the larger production team, one of the things that we were just most not concerned with, but really kind of anxious about, wanted to know once it was released, was how fans were going to react to it. Because, you know, the film, it's a 4-part docuseries. The first 2 parts really do celebrate the band and all of its contributions to pop music and all of the sort of barriers that the boys broke for Latinx musicians, Puerto Rican musicians. But the last 2 episodes really kind of delve into some of the harder things that the band members experienced while they were in the band. And, you know, not much of what we reveal in the docuseries is had not been published or had not been sort of exposed before. But I don't think that many fans knew about it. And so for us, it was a tricky balance between celebrating the band, but also talking about these harder things that we felt were necessary, that the band members themselves, you know, in our conversations with them, this is what they were putting forward, they felt was necessary. And so the thing that we were anxious about was when it finally was released, how the fans were going to engage with it. Were they going to understand that, you know, what we were attempting to do is, yes, celebrate the band, but also have everyone understand the cost that, you know, that the band members paid to be in the band. And so far, I think what we're seeing is that the fans are getting it. You know, they really understand what we're trying to say with the film. They're really engaging with the band members and the things that they're sharing in the film, or in the series. Sorry, and that to me is a relief.
I imagine. Well, I think you've done it quite well, and actually lends itself naturally to a 4-parter, doesn't it? But I mean, let's celebrate the band. Let's talk about the celebration side of things first.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, maybe for our listeners, maybe can you maybe put Menudo in a historical perspective in terms of what they meant, you know, and many of us who were alive at the time and aware of them maybe didn't quite appreciate at the time.
Yeah, so I like to say that they're the sort of first modern global boy band in the way that we understand boy bands right now, right? I mean, of course, you had the Beatles. Of course, you had the Jackson 5. You even had groups like the Fosters. But when you think about boy bands, the way that we engage with them and consume them now, Backstreet Boys, you know, NSYNC, 98 Degrees, BTS, right? Menudo is the first band to really commercialize young men in this way, right? And, you know, for Puerto Ricans don't need a lot to be proud, don't need a lot to sort of start talking about how amazing we are and how proud we are of our island. But this is one of those situations where, and most of the situations are true, but this is one of the situations where, you know, Menudo, as Puerto Ricans representing a small island in the Caribbean that has a very complex relationship with the United States, they really did this first, and Menudo through extension really brought, you know, like a lot of attention and brought a lot of pride and joy to the island, because we're talking about a time period, you know, this is the late 70s through the mid 90s. Puerto Rico's coming out of a recession, really had suffered a lot in terms of just sort of restructuring in its economy through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? Really needs a win. And Menudo just sort of comes out, it goes into the world, it really kind of strikes a chord in the youth in Latin America, and then really just kind of takes the world by storm in the 80s, right? And so it's a really big deal for the island. It's a really big deal for the diaspora, you know, like Puerto Ricans in the United States and other parts of the world. And it's, I mean, it's just amazing for us to be able to say that they did it first. You know, I think the other thing so that's what we always sort of lead with, right? They're the first boy band. But I think that when we think about global youth culture, it's also the first model, that is, from a small island like Puerto Rico, connecting to Venezuelans, to Peruvians, to Mexicans, to people in the United States, to Italians. I mean, they had Italian albums. They were massive in Brazil. They were, they went to Japan several times. Really big in the Philippines. This is the late 70s, early 80s that we're talking about. It seems very common now. I mean, anyone can become globally famous using social media, but back then there wasn't social media, right? And so it's a big feat for a very small, what starts as a small kind of family-run operation out of a place like Puerto Rico to explode in this way. It's a really big thing, and it's an interesting enough model, for the music industry, that a big label like RCA signs them for a multi-million-dollar, multi-year deal, right? That's not a small thing, right? The other thing that I think is really, and so kind of going back to being proud Puerto Ricans, I also think they do a lot for, this is the late 70s, early 80s. There's a lot of people that are immigrating to the United States from places like Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Mexico, Puerto Rico. I mean, we're citizens, but, there are a lot of Puerto Ricans now not on the island living in the United States. And at this time in the early 80s, you're a Puerto Rican living in New York. You're a Mexican living in New York. This idea of Latinx as an identity, as, your experience coming from a place like Puerto Rico or coming from a place like Mexico, but living in the United States as a distinct experience, that's not quite articulated yet in the 80s, right? We're living in our little communities. Menudo is the first time where Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and El Salvadorans and Hondurans in the United States have a touchstone, right? We have a band that we can celebrate that's speaking in our language, right? Yes, they're from Puerto Rico, but you can be from another part of Latin America, be a Spanish speaker, right? And love them, idolize them. And that's an important thing, not just for the adults, because we're in a lot of the archival footage, we find that the adults are super happy that their daughters are into Menudo because they're worried that their children are going to start losing the language. So they're like, great, if my daughter wants to celebrate this band that speaks Spanish, amazing. But it's really important for that generation, that young generation, that first, second generation of people living in the diaspora to find that commonality and to finally be seen, right? I think that's the thing that we hear a lot from the fans, that we hear, that we heard in the archival, but also heard in our interviews with the fans, that before Menudo, if you are Puerto Rican living in the South Bronx, a lot of what you're confronting in the media, a lot of the representations of yourself in the media are that you are, you live in communities that are crime ridden, right? You live in communities that are dangerous, right? When Menudo shows up, that's not the narrative because they're polished, right? They are projecting goodwill, they're projecting good values, and they're being celebrated. Ed Koch, the mayor of New York at the time, brings them to City Hall and gives them keys to the city, right? They're at the UN, they're at Madison Square Garden, they're at Radio City Music Hall, they're at these premier venues. And it's the first time for a lot of young people that they see themselves in someone that to me is one of the most important things that Menudo does. They really allow for young people in the Spanish-speaking diaspora in the United States to have a bigger sense of themselves and to have a sense of, I can go places too. Because up until that point, that's not the messages that they're getting in the U.S. media, right? That's not the representations of themselves that they're getting in the media.
I was just going to say, I think that was all excellent because if I can add my own little bit of perspective on this, I grew up in South Texas and as what we would call an Anglo down there. I did work with, this was early 80s, working with Latinos, and it was, me settling on that there are all these different cultural differences within the Latino community, right? But that wasn't what then I discovered. They were really Menudo. I think the other one that comes to mind is someone like Gloria Estefan, right? They were, who's Cuban from South Florida, but that, they were the guys I worked with in South Texas were so excited about this. You know, this was something that was their Spanish language was being celebrated. Their kids were interested in holding on to the language. These sort of things were, it was quite the phenomenon, as you've pointed out, in terms of where, you know, what had been before, and then they and Menudo and along with others were changing.
Yeah, and you know, if I may just belabor the point a little bit more, right? I think that like this thing about languages, we express it in the series, but there's a lot to say, and we don't really go into it too much. But it's hugely important, you know, now to some extent, depending on where you are in the world, right? Being bilingual, being multilingual is celebrated, right? It's an asset. I mean, you know, I came up in, you know, I was born in '83, so you know, my kind of like formative years are in the '90s, but even in the '90s, you know, growing up in the US, speaking Spanish wasn't something that was celebrated, you know, like, yes, if you went to Spanish class and you were a little bit more advanced, great, awesome, right? But if you were out in the streets, you know, or if you were out in certain places, speaking Spanish wasn't something. I think that's another really big thing that Menudo does. That is not uncommon today. You know, BTS is probably the biggest pop boy band in the world right now, and they speak Korean. I mean, I've seen kids in Newark, New Jersey, you know, just, you know, losing their minds over BTS, and they don't understand what they're saying, but it doesn't matter anymore. Back then, it did matter. Back then, if you were, you know, in certain parts of New York City or you're in certain neighborhoods and you're talking Spanish to your parents, right, that stigmatized you. So for Menudo to do what they did, all in Spanish to an extent, right? There is a part where they do crossover and they start singing in English, right? But their early success, what got them there, was just songs in Spanish, right? That's a big deal. And it's a big deal, not just because they're breaking barriers in their own language, but it's a big deal because they're allowing people who are native Spanish speakers in the United States or in the diaspora to finally feel seen.
Yeah, I mean, this was at the same time that you had some states. I remember California, people pushing for laws to make English the official language. You know, there's no official language in the United States, but it's obvious that English is the lingua franca of the U.S. But, you know, there were these kind of efforts in place to stamp down on actually use of Spanish in public places and in the workplace and stuff like that. So, but besides, I mean, we could go on. I know our time is tight, actually, but we could go on about the celebratory side, and it's your film, the docuseries celebrates that. Some great archival that you have, and showing the phenomenon that was and is Menudo. But then there was this darkness also behind this feel good story, and maybe you could talk about. I mean, you people should watch the series. You go into a lot of detail, but I mean, maybe you can tell us a little about the conditions that these boys had to operate under.
Yeah, so I think most of the stuff, most of the light stuff, is not of any surprise. You know, it's a music industry, and it's a music industry in a money making capitalist system. So, you know, I think that when people hear that these kids were overworked, when they hear that, not at first, but you know, within like 2 or 3 iterations of the band, because you know the model is that the brand stays the same, but what we do is we wrote, you know, what they did was they rotated out the boys as they aged out. So the second they hit, you know, the rule was the second they hit puberty, right, or they got too old, that's it, you're gone, you're celebrated, thank you for your time. And then they brought in a much younger, boy to replace the person who's leaving, right? That wasn't a hard and fast rule, especially towards the end, right? But you know, that model of like rotating people out meant for those 3 or 4 years that boy was in the band, the machine, right, Menudo the machine, had to extract maximum profit from them. And so in the early years, the band members were partners in the organization, right, partners in Menudo. But very quickly, the management figures out that it's going to be much more convenient for them, and much more profitable for them if they have them on a salary. So it was sort of scaled, right? You went in at one salary, and the longer you stayed with the band, your salary went up, but it did cap, right? And so what happens when commercial deals are being brought in, right? What happens when, Colgate wants you to do a commercial for them, or I believe it was McDonald's, or what happens when you do TV appearances, right? When you're on ABC shows, right? Where does that money go? Well, the money goes to the organization, right? It goes to Menudo, and then it is paid out in your salary. So, if you're making tons of money off of commercial deals, right, but that's not being translated to money that's being given to the band members, that's not exactly fair, or at least that's the perspective of the band members, right? That it wasn't equitable, it wasn't fair, right? So a lot of that was going on. When I say overwork, I mean, what we heard from these guys is that they would leave in January and not see their family until like December, right? They would just go. They would go on tour. Yeah, sure, they would come back like maybe for a weekend here and there, but they're basically, once they're in the band and once they start heading out on tour, on the road nonstop. And once they're on the road, right, their daily schedule is pretty rigorous. Waking up at 6 a.m., maybe doing a little bit of school, although schooling wasn't consistent and schooling wasn't a priority. But maybe they did like half an hour in the morning, right, while they're having breakfast. And then from 7, let's say, on, they're doing stuff related to the enterprise, either practicing or going on radio promotion or TV promotion or magazine promotion or doing concerts. And then they don't go to bed until very late in the evening, right? Very late at night, right? That's the kind of conditions that these guys are working under. And so that's sort of the light stuff, the exploitation light that we call, that we would call it, right? That it isn't a total surprise, right?
Yeah, and we just remind ourselves we're talking about 12 to 15, 16-year-old boys in working under these conditions. But then it's more than ridiculously long hours. So then I guess the sort of phase 2 or whatever of is the physical and mental abuse as well. I mean, you even have the story about the one who was basically minutes away from dying because of emergency appendicitis and things like that. I mean, that sounded horrific.
Yeah, Angela. Yeah, so, this is something that I think we try to show as a part of the culture, right? A part of the culture of being behind the scenes in Menudo, the mental and physical abuse. I think some people will watch this and be like who would get on stage and in pain and perform to the point of, throwing up blood, right? Like, who would do that? But you got to understand that the first thing that I think was really shocking to us to find out is that Edgardo Diaz, when these kids entered the band, he was in loco parentis, right? He was effectively their legal guardian, right? And so that's number one, right? Like Edgardo Diaz and the Enterprise, Menudo the Enterprise, had legal guardianship over these boys. So once they leave their parents' home, right, that's it, right? They belong to Menudo. The other thing is that there is this behind the scenes culture. You come into the band and you're hazed naturally, right? I mean, any system, any culture, like, you have to adapt to it. But the hazing is very specific and very much about getting the new band member to conform to this behind the scenes culture, right? And so, and if you don't conform, if you don't fit, that's it, you're out. But from a perspective of a performer, right, who wants to be a Menudo, they audition for Menudo, like, this is the opportunity of a lifetime, right? So why would you squander that, right? So what you're going to do is you are going to conform, you are going to adapt, you are going to try to fit in this behind the scenes culture. So yeah, I mean, that early hazing, that they experienced, and this was consistent. We heard this from all the band members, that was very much about getting them to tolerate, a certain level of, abuse that most people would never tolerate. And so when someone tells a story like, I was up on stage, I blacked out, start coughing blood, and I black out and I wake up in the hospital, it's because you have to understand that Angelo is in an environment that is really set up to extract as much from him and really not care much about his well-being. And he, he was in it. He was in that culture. He was in that system. Yeah.
And then taking it to the deepest, darkest sides of things, these boys are surrounded by sexual predators. Their parents aren't around, as you say, and for some of them, they became victims of abuse and rape. Isn't that true?
Yes. So in the series, Angelo, he shared a story about being raped a series of times, and that's an extreme. That's a very extreme. That's a very extreme story. I don't want people to walk away with the impression that this happened to all the band members, because that's not true, right? Yeah. But what is true is that there was a pervasive behind the scenes environment where these boys were, they were being sexualized, on the album covers, in the merchandising, right? That didn't stop once they went home, once they stopped, they got off the stage and went back to the hotel rooms or went back home. And mind you, they often shared living space when they weren't on tour with the management, right? So they weren't going back home to their parents. They were going back home to these houses and these homes that like the management had set up around the world or in Puerto Rico, right? So that sexualization, that environment didn't stop, right? And the people who were around, who are helping. And so, this is something that we do kind of characterize in the documentary. When I say the people who are around, it could be the management. It could be, it's a big enterprise. So when you go to Mexico to tour, or when you go to Venezuela to tour, right, they're local promoters, they're local, so there are people in that sort of entourage, right, that also have a predilection for young boys, right? And so these are the people that the band members are engaging with and coming into contact with day in and day out, right? That are, that see these boys as sex icons, right? And so they were dealing with this consistently, and we share some stories in the film, and I should say that everything that's in our docuseries is stuff that we've been able to corroborate, right?
Right.
There's a lot of, it's not like, oh, this guy told me and we're going to put it in film. No, it doesn't work that way, right? Yeah. There's many points of reporting and corroboration, and just things that we're hearing kind of repetitive, that we feel comfortable saying, okay, this can be put in the docuseries, right? Yeah. So, but there's a lot of other stories that we've heard, that you can't put in there because, you maybe heard it from two people, or you don't have enough corroboration, right? The one thing I do feel confident saying is that, yes, when they were in the band, most of their days they were being sexualized on and off the stage.
Yeah. Well, and I guess we should say, there's allegations also made about Edgardo Diaz, and just to be fair, you've reached out to him and for comment, and he's himself has long denied any of these allegations. So we but as you say, certainly your journalism background comes to the fore, and so that's very much appreciated, actually. I'm gonna give our listeners a quick break, but we'll be right back with Kristofer Rios, one of the directors of Menudo, Forever Young, released in June on HBO Max. Most of you listening to this should have access to that around the world.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America.
Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with award-winning filmmaker Kristofer Rios, one of the directors of Menudo, Forever Young, released in June on HBO Max. So we've been talking about this this docuseries that you've done about the band Menudo. How did you get involved with this project? How was this your idea? I mean, how did this happen?
Yeah, I can't take credit for the idea. So, our director, my co-director, Manuel Soto, it's really his idea, and it's something that he, a lot of people think that that these things, you have the idea, and then in 3 months you're pitching it, and then in 6 months that's it, you've got the money and you're doing it.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work that way ever. Yeah. So Angel Manuel was working on this for, I want to say, 7 or 8 years, and he comes from the scripted world, although he does have experience in documentary. But right now he's actually making a film for Warner, and when he met our executive producers on this project, he had just finished a scripted film, and so he had envisioned this project as a scripted series. I think that anyone from my generation that grew up and born in the 80s and grew up in the 80s, 90s, and maybe a generation just before, they know Menudo. They know. I mean, I grew up with Menudo party favors being handed out at birthday parties, because I grew up a little bit on the island, right? Yeah. And so, but Angel Manuel, like, he actually quite literally grew up with these guys,
Wow.
He's from Santurce, and he knew some of these guys who ended up becoming band members. And so, as someone who grew up with these guys, and is friends with some of these guys, right? Just by growing up, right? Yeah. He knew some of this behind the scenes stuff that wasn't really being spoken out loud, right? Yeah. And so when he imagined the series, he really imagined it as one, first and foremost, one that allowed the narrative to be put into the hands of not necessarily just the band members, really all the behind the scenes players that never had their chance to tell their version of the story of Menudo. Because up until, I don't want to say up until this documentary series, but really up until quite recently, the people who really put their blood, sweat, and tears into making Menudo what it was didn't have an opportunity to share their version of the story. Edgardo and a few other people who were the ones who claimed to be Menudo, right? They were the ones who really kind of shaped the narrative of the band, shaped the legend and the lore of the band. When you go back and you look through the archival and you look at what adult is talking, what adult is telling the story of the band, it's Edgardo and a few other people. The band members, outside of just sort of the light sort of teeny bopper stuff that what's your favorite color? Do you like girls? Do you have a girlfriend? They didn't really get to share their story much outside of that stuff, right? So that was really Angel Manuel's vision. It was to tell the story about the band, scripted because it gave him a little bit more leeway, right? But tell the story about the band from the perspective of the band members. Well, someone else had the same idea. And so they kind of beat him to the punch. And so there is an Amazon Prime series that I think is, I don't actually know if it ever was widely released in the United States, but in Latin America, certainly you can see it, called Suete a mi moto. And it's a scripted, fictionalized version of the story of Menudo, right? Well, he was just, I think when that came out, he was kind of a little disheartened, but thankfully he connected with Cristina Costantini and Alex Fumero, who are the director and producer, respectively, of Mucho Mucho Amor, The Legend of Walter Mercado. It's a Netflix doc about the Puerto Rican astrologer. And they were at Sundance at the same time. So Angel was there for his film, and they were there for the doc. And they connect and because, great minds, right? And so I think it was sort of in that meeting at Sundance between Angel and Alex and Cristina where they were like, this project isn't dead. It might actually be better as a docuseries. And so that's where it starts. And so it took them about a year and a half to develop. And once it started to become, it was obvious it was a more serious project. That's when they brought me in. I know Alex and Cristina. So Cristina and I were immigration reporters at Univision Fusion for several years.
Okay.
And then Alex Fumero also, we used to work together at Univision Fusion. So they were thinking who would be a good showrunner to kind of come in and help make this story, make the story what it is now.
Yeah.
And that's how I get involved. And I think they thought of me, one, because I do have a background in I sort of have this background both in documentary filmmaking and news. Right. And they saw this not just as, yes, a celebration of the band, and we wanted to, do all that great stuff, but you can't tell this story without going into the things that we do go into in the later episodes. And they really felt like they needed someone with not necessarily an investigative background, but a journalistic background to navigate those stories in a way that, really we're going to be profound, but we're going to be, journalistically and ethical and above board.
And yes, and I think, I mean, as we've already alluded to, you do drag up a lot of, I was going to say dark secrets a lot, as you've noted. A lot of this stuff had been reported before, but these stories. I mean, how difficult was that for the former band members? Because how do you handle that? Because they share a lot of detail that I know it must have been very difficult for them to relive, if you will.
Yeah. I found that there are some very difficult things that are shared. And not all the interviews were easy. They were, I'm very grateful that all the people who participated in this, in this, and it's not just the band members, really all the people that participated in this documentary series, they came to us very open, and they came to us ready to be genuine. And I think if there's anything that's good about this docuseries, it's that the conversations that we have, they are genuine, It took, I think the hard part was convincing them that we weren't going to do more of the same, right? That we weren't going to do more of what had happened to them in the past. This isn't the first time that the band members have come forward to try to share what they experienced, right? When they did it in the past, sometimes it was well received, but most of the time there was a lot of victim blaming, there was a lot of doubt, there was a lot of sort of, the burden of proof was basically placed on them. What they were saying wasn't accepted at face value, which I think in most cases, when we're talking about people who've experienced the things that, sexual abuse and physical abuse and, this kind of mental abuse, violence, right? Like, we know now that like our default should be to believe the victims and then unpack it, right? That wasn't culturally, not just in Puerto Rico, but around the world. That wasn't what was the common practice back then, right? So they were very hesitant when we came forward and we said, hey, we want to do this docuseries, and we would really love to hear from your perspective. Naturally so. I think that we were persistent, and we really slowed down the process. I mean, when someone tells you, when a network tells you you have a year to make the thing, the instinct is to say, okay, let's get these guys right now, and let's pressure them. And and we knew we had nothing if we didn't have not just the band members, but genuine conversations with them. So we really took our time when approaching them to just have a conversation, right? The first time we talked to many of them, it wasn't like, hey, are you ready to do this? It was like, look, just hear us out, And if at the end of the conversation you say no, that's cool, but we just want you to hear us out. And thankfully, there were a couple of the guys who were really, they trusted us and they were brave, and we did those round of interviews very early, and then they talk, right? Like they were in a band together, and it's also sort of like a kind of brotherhood. So once we did the first couple of interviews, they started to kind of report back to the other guys what their experience was like with us, and that kind of then opened new channels of communication with some of the other band members. So I think that was the hardest part. once we got into the room, I think that we had built enough trust, and when we had shown to them that we were serious, right? That we had done our homework, and that we really were there to just kind of let them say what they needed to say, given our research and our reporting, right? But, let them kind of share their story. And so when they start to go into things that are more difficult, I mean, yeah, in the moment, it's emotionally draining for everyone, because you realize that you're bringing people back to things that are unpleasant and unhappy, right? But I think that on the other hand, we didn't just talk about the bad stuff. We talked about, their favorite times in the band. Yeah. And vibes are really great on set. Like we had an amazing field team, we had an amazing production team, and we really tried hard to, to create environments on set where it's like, yeah, we're going to talk about some hard things, but let's take a break. Let's go, have some coffee. Let's just talk about things that are not this for a second. We really, went out of our way to do those kinds of things, because it would be hard for anyone to go back to these times and to go back to these stories. So I like to think we were successful. We do have great rapport with with all the guys who participated. And so I think that that's a testament to it. But yeah, not easy. But, I think that at the end of the day, the most important thing was the trust and the respect, the mutual trust and respect that my team and myself had for these guys.
And it must have been something incredible for you as well, because as you said, you grew up as a child with this band, and now you're meeting all these former band members. That must have been a real kick.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I wasn't quite the demographic. I can't say I was more of a hip hop head. I can't say I was a fan, but I certainly am a fan now. I'll say that. Yeah, I have a record collection, and I started buying. Once you start sort of going into it and you start seeing the musical genius, like because there is musical genius there. I think the producers and the composers and the guys themselves, immense amount of talent. I started buying their records, and it's now part of. I haven't DJ'd in a while, but if I do, it'll be part of my, it'll be part of my routine. But yeah, I mean, it is. But that said, right? I think that to me, what was you do get starstruck, right? You do. And look, we never sat down with Ricky Martin, we never sat down with Draco Rosa, like the big guys who, are, sort of a different category of star, but that's okay. I mean, these guys are as professional as any superstar that, that you would come across. I'll tell you that much. They really know what they're doing. That discipline that they learned, so many years ago while being in the band, it continues to this day. And they bring that professionalism. So you do feel a little starstruck when you meet these guys, right? And yeah, I'm a super Menudo fan now. Maybe not as serious as some of the people you see in the film who have Menudo everything on their walls, but I probably know as much and certainly respect and love them as much.
And so what do you want the docuseries legacy to be? A celebration of Menudo, but also maybe a cautionary tale of fame and what can happen?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly that. Yeah, I certainly do think that, in the last couple years, we've seen things like, and this is not putting our series on par with these. I'm just saying Leaving Neverland and the Britney Spears doc, in the sense that we're taking pop icons and we're exploring the stories that we didn't explore when we were consuming their music and when they were icons, right? I think that if there's anything to take away in the immediate, it's that, as consumers of anything really, but especially of music, as fans of music, right? We really do have to consider how our participation in that market, right? How our dollars and our consumption, right, what impact and effect that has on the person that's making the music, right? Because there's the image that's being packaged and that's being sold to you, right? But then there's the person behind that, right? Kind of different, right? But Kanye West, right? We know that Kanye West, who's the musician and who is the rapper and the producer, and then there's a Kanye West that goes on to TMZ and goes on to these shows and looks like he's losing his mind, and we dismiss him, right? We say he's losing his mind, right? Well, there's a person there, and there's a person that's going through things, and yes, he's making a lot of money. We're helping him make a lot of money, but there's still a person there, right? And so I think that the thing that I learned through this process is that we shouldn't be so dismissive of these pop stars' humanity, right? Because we miss a whole lot. We miss a whole lot in the moment, and then many years later we have to go and make a documentary to revisit that and say, oh wow, this is how we contributed to that, right? So I think that one thing that we are learning, certainly, through these documentaries that are exploring the history of these pop stars, right, is that when it happens in the moment, we should maybe take a step back and say, okay, what is happening here, right? And not just dismiss them as these pop stars. So that's the one thing. But I think the other thing I hope on an industry level, right? And I say industry, I mean like doc filmmaking, is that we can both, like, something can both be great and also difficult. And I think that there's a tendency, like, nuance is not always celebrated, right? There's a tendency to believe that, like, the audience can't get it. And I'm certainly not saying that that's what our experience on this project. We had the network was amazing and really supported us and really got it from the beginning, right? But generally, it's like we don't really think that those two things can happen, right? Like that, two things can hold the same space. And so there's a lot of great stories that aren't told, right? If there's one narrative that exists about something, and that's sort of the established narrative, but then there's something that counters that, it's like, well, is that true? And it takes many, many, many years for this counter narrative to then kind of become, more weighted, right? For then us to explore it. I mean, this docuseries could have been done like many years ago, right? I mean, it would. Yeah, I mean, it's not. The material was all there, right? And it's just because there was this myth of Menudo, this legend of Menudo, that it was this great thing, and then there was this other stuff that was bubbling, right? But it wasn't. It's like, how could this great thing also do, like, kind of harm the people involved in it in this way, right? How? And it's like, they can both be true, and the guys would tell you this. It's like, yes, I had some of the most amazing times in my life while in the band, and I also had some of the worst times in my life while in the band, and they're both true. And so I think as doc filmmakers, or as storytellers, or as people in this industry, when we're looking for stories, we shouldn't be afraid to, and it's certainly changing, right? But we shouldn't be afraid to go at stories that are a little contradictory, because I think there's so much more there that's interesting, right? So much more, like, when it's both true, it's like, that's a 4-part docuseries, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think you've just brilliantly summed up what I love about documentary filmmaking and what I think is happening in the industry as well. And may that long continue, and may you long continue making great docuseries and features. And we look forward to having you on again sometime, Kristofer. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. So. And all well done while having COVID. So
yeah, thank you.
You just.
I hope that made sense.
Yeah, you made more. You made plenty of sense, I can tell you right now. Right. So I just want to say thank you again to Kristofer Rios, one of the directors and one of the producers of Menudo, Forever Young. It's currently on HBO Max. Do go watch it, and hopefully we can have Kristofer on again with his next project. So thanks again, Kristofer, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I'd like to give a shout out to Sam and Joe Graves at Intersound Audio in Eskrick, England, in deepest, darkest Yorkshire. A big thanks to Nevin Apaunovich, podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who ensures we continue getting great guests onto the show. And finally, a big thanks to our listeners. As always, we love to hear from you, so please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas. You can reach out to us on YouTube, social media, or directly by going to our website, www.factualamerica.com, and clicking on the Get in Touch link. And as always, please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.